Welcome to Talking About Somerville. Today's program is going to be on transportation. Transportation is central to our lives, to our economic well-being, to subjects as critical as environmental justice, how we get to work, whether we build something near a new transportation link or not. All of it figures into our lives very deeply. Today, to talk about the issues connected with transportation, and in particular the Green Line extension, focusing, as a matter of fact, on history, Union Square, Somerville's role in transportation. I have with me Representative Denise Provost, who represents Somerville, and community activist Wig Zamore. So I'd like to start in by asking Representative Provost, where do we stand on the Green Line extension?
Great question, Bob, and I'm glad that you've asked it because I hear it everywhere I go. The Baker administration, in light of some very high cost offerings from the state's contractor on the Green Line extension, has commenced a review process and has both in-house and has engaged a number of consultants to review different areas of the project and will be delivering a report at the December 9th joint meeting of the MassDOT board and the Management Oversight Control Board, the new board that has been put in place over MBTA.
When you say they'll deliver a report, what does that mean? How does that play into the future of the Green Line extension?
Well, the various consultants and staff have been charged with looking at the project delivery method, the costs, with how the costs became so inflated over the lifetime of the project, ways possibly to lower the costs, ways to raise revenue, and proceed with what they're calling an appropriately scaled project.
In their view, appropriately scaled.
Yes. So I imagine the report will be a combination of factual information and probably some recommendations.
Well, thank you. The idea of the Green Line extension has been around for a long time. Wig, you've been around for a long time also. You've been, I guess, a founding member of Mystic View Task Force, founding member of Somerville Transportation Equity Partnership. You play a really important role in the development of Union Square, and part of the focus of your study has been on the health effects of transportation modalities, clean air, dirty air, human health.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about how we got to where we are today.
Sure. So I think it's common knowledge that a long time ago, Somerville had a lot of trolley stops and tram lines. And after World War II, the transportation paradigms changed quite a bit in the United States. So we went on a very large highway building process. And we tended to abandon a lot of the historic transit, public transit, which was a little smaller scale, at least locally, and then the normal trains regionally or further afield. And so what had been public transit in Somerville was cut back significantly. And then in Massachusetts, actually, was the first place where people started to question the highway building. So Governor Sargent,
This is in
Republican,
what year?
About 1970. There was a lot of concern in Cambridge and other urban communities about bringing this highway building into the inner city, basically.
So there's an idea to extend I-95 through the city.
I-93.
I-93
Right.
through the city, And the first thing that happened was parts of Roxbury were demolished to
Right.
make way for that highway.
Right.
And then,
Well, right, and I think that was, yeah, there's been a couple of the highways. Go ahead. Yep.
and then people in Cambridge and Brookline, who were the natural constituents of the governor at the time, Francis Sargent, is that his name? Said, not in my backyard. You will not run the highway up Brookline Street in Cambridge through Central Square,
Right.
through the Fenway where the museum school is. You will not do that.
And
so what happened?
Well, I think a lot of people's surprise, the governor was Republican. He had a background in friendship for the road construction industry, but to everybody's surprise, he said, we're going to put on the brakes and we're going to do a regional transportation study. And that became a very famous study, both here and nationally. He had some real talent coming up. So he had Alan Altshuler, who came up and became the first transportation secretary for the state. Fred Salvucci was a young man. And there were a lot of community activists and really great citizens who had an interest in the quality of life in the urban core, who were part of that really robust transportation review. And during the course of that, they did look at reestablishing rail-based transit in Somerville, like Green Line, and Ball Square had very high ridership projected numbers. But eventually they decided that the two big projects they would do for transit were to extend the Green Line, and we benefited from Davis Square, and that was tough.
That was the Red Line.
The Red Line, I'm sorry, yes, thank you. The Red Line through Davis, and Arlington didn't want it, parts of Cambridge didn't want it, Tip O'Neill helped a little, and local activists and leadership here helped. And then they decided to cancel the highway coming in the Orange Line corridor, and
The I-95.
what became the Orange Line corridor, yes. And but here, and they built the Orange Line, and they took down the elevated, which is still controversial because that was along main arterials in and out of the core of Boston.
Washington
but
Street.
here, they decided to finish I-93, which had stopped outside Somerville's boundary, and bring it into the heart of Boston. So here alone in Somerville, after the passage of the Clean Air Act of 1970, they went ahead with a major highway building in a very dense urban neighborhood, fully knowing that air pollution was going to violate pretty much all the major tenets of the Clean Air Act of the country and also the state standards.
So, Representative Provost, what happened back then when they decided to build the highway, notwithstanding the impact on Somerville, our dense neighborhoods, and the air quality of our city?
Well, there were protests in Somerville. That's been well documented. And the protesters in Somerville got support from architects and planners outside the city. But the leadership of the city at that time, and this is going back to the early and mid-'70s, wanted to see this road built. It was called the Inner Belt, and Inner Belt Road in Somerville is one little vestige of the anticipation and the hopes for that project, which I think were misplaced and have not materialized.
We've changed our view of highways, haven't we?
Not
or have we?
well. I don't know that everyone has changed their view of highways. I think that what highways have done to a lot of cities is increasingly recognized as destructive. And you know, the depression of the central artery through Boston, you know, is a good example of what happens when you make a big elevated roadway go away. Of course, within Somerville, we've still got the big elevated roadway. I I think one of the biggest changes has been the renewal of interest in urban mass transit, in trolleys and light rail, and you're seeing these projects all over the country, including in places like Southern California, where a lot of people never expected to see transit bloom.
Well, what will happen, I realize this is hypothetical, but what will happen to Somerville if and when the Green Line extension actually materializes?
Well,
What is the promise?
the promise, there are multiple promises. One is the promise of being able to get from the middle of Somerville into downtown Boston in less than 50 minutes, which is, what it takes me if I walk to a train station or take a bus to a train station, and basically traveling west to go east. But it will open up transit and one-seat rides to many, many, many people in the most densely populated city in New England. That should spur economic development because well-placed transit usually does. Look at Cambridge.
Talk a little bit more. Would you elaborate on why transportation is really important to the physical development and the economic health of a dense city like Somerville?
Well, one of the important things about a local economy is how easily and readily people are able to get to employment centers. It's something that employers look at when they locate. It's something that prospective employees look at when they're considering their options. And the matchup in Greater Boston is not that great. Urban Land Institute has done some great studies, and MAPC as well, showing that people in Greater Boston waste a lot of time in traffic. Their commuting costs are relatively high, and that improving transit to an area is good for employers, and of course that's good for the economy generally because it means it's good for employees. Part of the equation is doing the right kind of development around or redevelopment around transit nodes, but having transit that's conveniently located and accessible to a lot of people and, steps away from the places where people live and work and go to school and look for recreation. It's very, very important to the health of a city.
Speaking of health, Wig, what is the link between good public transportation, as in the promise of the Green Line extension, to human health, air quality, those kinds of things?
Sure. Well, I think you need to look at both sides. So as it happens, Somerville has the most vehicle miles driven per square mile, and they're almost all highway miles, I-93 and the arterial highways that go into Boston along the northwestern corridor. That's the densest corridor in the state. And we also
define what the Northwest Corridor really is.
Well, so I-93 goes northwest from North Station and the financial district of Boston through Somerville and then feeds the suburbs in that direction.
Okay.
And there are arterial highways that also cross at North Station. So McGrath and O'Brien, Route 28, Rutherford Avenue, they all cross in a very, very narrow corridor, and they are the heaviest corridor of vehicular traffic in the state. Somerville also has all of the northern diesel commuter rails going through. So we have over 100,000 vehicle miles traveled per day per square mile of city area. That's average across the whole city, but most of that is in the northeastern half of the city. And then we have 200 diesel commuter rails going through per day as well. So that's about 15,000 per year per square mile. So we have the most commuter traffic through the city. Less than 5% of the people on those trains or those highways work in Somerville or live in Somerville. So basically the community is overrun for the benefit of the regional economy, which doesn't stop here. So that creates a lot of health issues for the people who live closest to it or who go to school or work closest to us, really serious health issues. I'm not sure we want to spend too much time on that today, but cardiovascular mortality, lung cancer mortality, childhood asthma, much higher autism levels in children that are born and spend their infancy next to highways. On the flip side, our centers, our town centers like Davis Square and Union Square and the others are not really accessible to those highways anyway. So you couldn't get huge numbers of cars in and out of Union Square. Nobody knows how to do that except the people who cut through to work in Cambridge and the people who live here. But if we reestablish clean transit, then that has much less environmental impact. People can live without cars, so there's less impact in the community as a whole. People can find out how to get here and around. And it also, because of the frequency of either light rail or subway, you can support retail, you can support restaurants, you can support office space, you can support research and development space. And Somerville, ironically, is the least sustainable community in Massachusetts when you look at live-work balance. So Somerville has 5,000 jobs shortage per square mile relative to the workforce that lives here per square mile. That is the biggest imbalance in the Commonwealth, and that in turn means the community, although it's median income and not impoverished, the community has a very great shortage of fiscal resources to pay for public schools and teachers, to pay for park space, to pay for other quality of life amenities. So I think if we want to remain a median income community, we need to work on getting the clean transit so people can live a healthier life, walking, biking, transiting, and we need to balance the jobs and the workforce and the housing.
Representative Provost, there is a funding issue with getting the Green Line extended and improving the quality of life. What are the mechanisms by which the Green Line can be funded, and what are the competing entities such as education and health that also are fighting for limited funding?
Well, you know, that the competition is sort of relative to the funding source. The main sources of funding for the Green Line extension so far have been state bonds, which is debt. The state issues debt in order to do capital projects. It's not done out of our annual operating budgets.
We borrow the money.
We borrow the money long-term for long-term projects that are intended to last a while. And of course, we have to pay interest on that money that we borrow. But what was intended to be the state's share of the project and then some has been included in transportation bond bills. And of course, the other competition for transportation bond money is other transportation projects in the state, which includes road projects as well as transit. So that's an internal competition, geographically between areas that are also looking to improve their economies and have better transportation.
Could you describe a little bit about the mechanism by which these interests in the far out suburbs, the exurbs, which need better road systems or fixing their bridges, what is the mechanism by which all of these entities, including Somerville, compete? How does that work?
Well, That's probably a really complicated explanation to give in a show of this length. To some extent, it's a matter of political jostling, of different geographic areas having their leadership make a convincing case for funding. There are other complications to do with bond bills. They have to be proposed by a governor, but they also have to be they have to be spent. Authorized monies can only be spent by the governor. The legislature can authorize them, in fact, has to authorize them, but the authorization is not the same as the bonds actually being issued, so that the money can be spent. Mm-hmm. But there's an authorization of $1.2 billion for the Green Line extension. And of course, another big source of funding for the Green Line extension is a federal grant, which is a highly competitive discretionary grant called a New Starts grant, for which the Green Line extension project qualified about a year ago. And part of the reason that we qualified was because we raised the gas tax and put more money into transportation at the state level.
So what happened with the raising of the gas tax?
Well, we did do that, although what was called indexing, which would have been an automatic increase of the gasoline tax at the rate of inflation, was repealed by the voters. So the projections for that revenue are a bit down from what they would have been in the absence of that repeal.
So that link to the rise of cost of living and the gas tax was broken during a referendum during
Yes.
one of the, what year was that election? 2 years ago or something like that?
It was, yes.
Yeah, just about 2 years ago. So the implications of that,
Year.
what?
I think it was last year.
Last year. So the implications of
14.
that with the delinking of the gas tax from inflationary growth has had a direct impact on the money available for the Green Line extension.
It's had some impact, although again the gas tax revenue goes into the operating budget rather than the capital budget. But they're obviously interrelated, because the ability of the MBTA to operate an extended Green Line once it's built is affected by how much operating budget we have for transportation.
I see. What is the operating budget for transportation? Do we know?
We could dig it out, and on another show, we could do a demonstration of the Commonwealth's open checkbook, which is a database that allows anyone to search quite a lot of information about how the Commonwealth spends its money.
Well, let's just go to how the T spends its money. Mm-hmm. We've heard, for example, in recent months, that the cost of maintaining and the public transportation system, the T system, has grown, that trains are broken, they have to be replaced or repaired and so forth. How significant are those costs of repair as it applies to the Green Line extension?
Well, it's a legacy of deferred maintenance. Back in 2007, there was a blue ribbon commission of transportation experts and finance experts that did a study and said that Massachusetts was going to have a shortfall of $1 billion per year over the next 10 years in funding for transportation infrastructure. But it still took a long time to raise even small amounts of additional revenue for transportation in Massachusetts.
Well, should we be optimistic that we'll get the Green Line extension?
I'm always optimistic. I couldn't do my job if I were a pessimist.
Well, I think you also have to keep in mind that the Green Line is an environmental obligation. So unlike other transportation projects that remain commitments of the state, the Green Line is the major Clean Air Act obligation of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And if it's not done, then and not replaced by other projects, which would likely be much more expensive for the same environmental benefit, then all of our federal transportation funding stops. So we were put on probation by the federal government about 4 or 5 years ago because we hadn't made progress with the Green Line. The Boston MPO and the state were put on probation. If they had gone 18 months without moving it forward, the funding would have been cut off, which would have been extremely dramatic because that is about $1 billion a year. And we have advantage in that nobody else has, and it's it's related to the Big Dig, and that was apparently a $24 billion project. Did not really have environmental benefits to it, so.
Okay, so I think we have to leave it at that. The way we understand it, that the Green Line will happen by 2017 or thereabouts.
Later.
Later. Okay.
Oh, yes. At this point, the earliest that we've been told is the end of 2018.
Okay, so let's leave it at that. We will rejoin this discussion between now and 2018. And thank you all for joining us. We will be back with another edition of Talking About Somerville. Thank you.